Giant in the Forest by Frank Belknap Long. Clarice said, "Peter, I feel so sorry for that poor little Martian in Ward C. You don't know what it means to be a telepath and have to brood over the pain and shock in other minds." She shook down a thermometer and placed it in a sterile metal case, her eyes pleading. "Couldn't you take a slight risk and certify him as healed? He wants so desperately to go to the stars again." "He was in a bad accident," I said. "The broken bones have to knit." Her eyes grew accusing. "He's almost healed, I'm sure of it. Why do you have to be such a perfectionist?" I looked at my darling, serene and beautiful in her blue nurse's uniform, and pictured her sitting in candlelight in a smoky old restaurant, her hand tight in mine while I whispered into her ear. That aspect of her wasn't quite in harmony with the cold gray walls of the hospital room, but it warmed the inner man. "Olno Druk has a first-rate mind, and he's bound to get all kinds of honors," I said. "When you get to feeling sorry for him, just remember that the Third Martian Treaty guarantees Martians full equality with us in all scientific pursuits." I patted her shoulder. "That's all that matters, to feel a sense of unity in achievement, to know you're respected as an equal. Martian bones are more brittle than ours and take longer to mend. And Druk's a telepath, sure. He's wide open to pain and grief when he's in close proximity to humans, but nature's inequalities are trivial in themselves. Druk can take it like the brave little guy he is." "Well, at least go downstairs and have another talk with him," my darling urged. "He worships you, Peter." "Does he now?" "He really does, Peter." I smiled at her and gave her arm a squeeze. "Tonight at 8, I said. "See you then." The warmth, the glow, was momentary. I walked out into the corridor with a stethoscope draped around my neck, a man in the image of a living human being, but feeling more like a mummy from an ancient Peruvian salt mine. We worked around the clock at Explorer's Aid, but sometimes we run out of time and have to manufacture a little on the quiet. I found Druk in Ward C, sitting before an easel with a slender paintbrush in his hand. To keep his mind off his troubles, the recreational director had taught him to paint like Gauguin. Gauguin, it seems, was a painter who'd made quite a splash on Earth 4 centuries ago. Strong and proud and confident, Gauguin had painted women in barbaric costumes on long golden afternoons, his palette aflame with hot jungle colors. Getting the bodies of the Earth women right had been a little difficult for Druk, because they didn't inspire in him any frenzies of delight. He'd simply imagined Earth women as they must have looked to Gauguin and painted them unabashed. "Splendid, Olno Druk," I said. "You're making real progress." He swung about, his big gray ears flapping, and his gnome face breaking into a smile. "You like it, Peter." "I like her," I said. "How did you ever learn to paint like that?" "Anything Gauguin can do, I can do better," Druk said. "He had a great natural gift for creation, but he did not know how to make a human woman attractive to more than this type of man or that type of man. You have to be a telepath to widen the appeal." His big ears drooped, and a spasm of pain crossed the gnome features. "Someone is suffering in the next ward," he said. "An accident case. Peter, I'm well enough to leave." He shivered and gripped my wrists with his skinny fingers, his eyes imploring. "Take me out of here, Peter." Before I could reply, the communicator globe lighted up, and a voice said, "Calling Dr. Jarvin. Dr. Jarvin, come to Ward E immediately, please. That is all." Druk released my wrist, and I could tell by his expression that he had conquered his fear and had something important to tell me. But all he said was, "Your brother is back from the stars, Peter." Not how badly Seaton had been hurt, or even whether I could count on finding him alive. Druk pretended not to know, and I had to get the details from the nurse by phone on my way upstairs. It wasn't too bad. Seaton was still conscious, and he had sent for me himself. Seaton had come back alive from the stars. To walk to the stars was tremendous. It was a brief walk, and your feet hardly moved at all. 1 minute you'd be with friends, warm and secure, and very sure of yourself, saying goodbye to a dark-eyed girl, perhaps, or holding in your arms a rather pathetic little figure wishing you luck. The next, you'd be collapsing into nothingness, your body and mind and hopes of eternity transferred from one vibrating metal disk to another vibrating metal disk across tens of thousands of light years. One step forward into the teleport. For an instant, brief as a dropped heartbeat, you ceased to be a man with the blood warm in your veins and became a swirl of anti-gravitics in the chill gulfs between the stars. It was not always a safe walk. Despite every safety device which human genius could devise, accidents happened. Sometimes the transmission field blanked out, a gap formed, and human blood and bone ran like quicksilver into light millennia beyond the reach of human colonization. Sometimes the scanning mechanism failed, and an explorer emerged from a teleport, shattered in body and mind, and for a few, the walk was over before it began. My brother Seaton was one of the lucky ones. A shouting, disheveled Goliath he was, 6'5" in his stockings, and he'd come back wild-eyed and delirious and wiping blood from his mouth. On the strength of his injuries, they'd put him to bed and given him a pretty red-haired nurse. They'd swabbed his face for needles, and then, at his own request, they'd sent for me. As I strode along, I thought back to when the first explorer went out into space, and the first physician had been born to look after him. I'd never fired a gun, and all my adventures came to me second-hand, but every time the dawn came up, I counted myself the luckiest lad alive. I wondered if Seaton would calm down when he saw me. I shut my eyes and pictured him walking through an unexplored wilderness where the Milky Way dimmed to a thin sprinkling of stars. Strange vermilion-crested birds flaunted their plumage from every thicket, and rippling flashes of sunlight played over his tousled head and broad, straight shoulders. Surely, to explore a new world was to be a god. I thought of the men who had gone first in ships, traveling at many times the speed of light, and letting fall from the blurring rim of overdrive the teleports which now dotted the planets of 1,000 suns. I thought of them and pitied them. They had paved the way, and their rewards had been great, but surely to go alone was to know a far greater intoxication. It was the old primeval human dream, recaptured in an age of scientific fulfillment. One lone man against the stars, pitting his intelligence and naked strength against the mystery and terror of the universe. Its beauty, too, its terrible beauty, that could wean a man from tilled fields and orchard hillsides, and make him dream of vast jungles, star-girded, tumbling into night, 1,000 light-years from Sol. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptics. I entered and shut the door quietly, knowing full well that a man could come back from the stars feeling as strong as an ox and be dead in 20 minutes from parathyroid shock. The red-haired nurse, who might have been the twin of a girl Seaton had been carrying the torch for a month before, turned quickly when she heard my footsteps on the tiled floor. The room was lighted by a warm glow from the wall panels, and her hair flamed as she turned. For an instant, I found myself envying Seaton, without quite understanding why. Seaton was sitting up straight, and when he saw me, he let out a great shout. "Peter, lad, come here and let me look at you." I went over to him, nodding at the nurse who was trying to look professional, and gave him a gentle poke in the ribs. I grinned and did my best to make him think he'd be out of bed in an hour. My brother Seaton. Thick black hair he had, almost as coarse as a wolf's pelt. His eyes were dark and piercing, and nothing you could say to him could tame him when he wanted to behave like a wild man. You'd never think he was a gentle scholar who could reel off the weight of every known element, determine a spectrum line to within 1/5,000,000th of an inch, and outsmart me in a game of chess. You came through raving, I said. He laughed. I'm fit as a fiddle now, Peter. It was just the scanners. They jolted me up like 1,000 wild horses, shooting sparks from their manes. I'm checking you over anyway, I said. Open your shirt. I was pressing the stethoscope to his chest when he said in a low, earnest whisper, Peter, lad, how would you like to go where you'd be free to help people in a really big way? He told me then about a world he'd just left. Calyx 6 was an Earth-like planet inhabited by a fair-skinned race of humans who did not differ from us in any way. A stricken race, desperately in need of medical aid. A great and consuming weariness had come upon them, and they went about their tasks with a groping uncertainty, and sank down exhausted in the doorways of their homes long before the setting of the sun. Peter, I want to tell you about them. You know there have been periods in human history when everything ugly seems to vanish like a bad dream. Take the Homeric world, for instance. We think of it as half-mythical, bathed in a light that never was on sea or land. Actually, there must have been a period in the development of ancient Greece when conditions were very much as Homer described them. The great golden city-states already existed in embryo, so to speak, and the Greeks had been freed from the harshness and cruelty of barbarism, but they had not yet taken on the crushing burdens of civilization. Can't you just picture it, Peter? Shepherds piping their flocks home on purple hills, and women with water jugs on their heads wending their way toward white stone cottages, and the lost Ulysses coming in over the wine-dark sea, his crew bursting into song. There must have been many Ulysseses, many Penelopes, to welcome the wanderers home from the sea. Peter, these people are like that. I couldn't speak their language, but it was as though I had known them for all the years of my life. When you make friends, you can't desert them, Peter. You're strong enough to write out your report, I said. Perhaps you'd better get started. He shook his head stubbornly. Then his lips tightened, and he looked at me steadily for an instant, and spoke with a pleading urgency. Peter, you can't even begin to understand how beautiful their culture is. To see it disappear. It was a new experience for me, walking along a silent corridor with just a little square medical case and the clothes on my back. You can't teleport a laboratory to the stars, and a physician without all the equipment he's likely to need is at a great practical disadvantage. At my side walked Olno Druk. I was asking for it with a vengeance, but I did need a telepath, and Druk had put up a very convincing argument. I'd be along to look after him, wouldn't I? For the first time in my life, I was stepping out of character and betraying a trust. When you take your life oath, you give your promise to use your authority with calm maturity. The walk to the stars was tremendous, but a physician had no right to take it. Approaching the teleport, I could hear Seaton saying, When you make friends, it's hard to desert them, Peter, lad. He knew I was a pushover for that kind of talk. I had a healthy respect for explorers who refused to become bleeding hearts, but I did happen to be a physician. You take your oath, and you can't quite forget that your job is to heal. The teleport seemed to wink at us in chill mockery. Wait 3 minutes before you step in after me, Druk, I said. I'll be careful, Peter. I squared my shoulders and braced myself against the terrible hammer blow to the solar plexus which the scanners delivered before they blacked you out. Then I stepped forward into a roaring sea of light. The houses were beautiful beyond belief. 30 or 40 one-story houses, shining crystal bright in garish sunlight, each dwelling surrounded by thickets, and winding rustic paths and gardens, bright with blue and vermilion flowers. The teleport lay behind us on a russet hillside, its entrance choked with creeping vines. I'd emerged by pushing the vines aside and crawling out with scant regard for my dignity. Drook had scrambled out after me, and we'd descended the hill together. There didn't seem to be any people about. I turned to Drook and asked him if he could pick up any human thoughts. He shook his head. "Not a thing, Peter." "The village can't be deserted," I protested. "Seaton left less than 3 hours ago." "It doesn't take long to abandon a village," Drook said. I vaguely sensed that he was disturbed, and I couldn't help noticing that the scene before us seemed to lay a spell on him, heightening his gnomish aspect and diminishing his talkativeness. I found it necessary to remind myself that the qualities which made an explorer great couldn't be learned in schoolrooms. Drook knew how to adjust quickly to the baffling aspects of a new world, to blend with its strangeness and beauty chameleon fashion, until it yielded up its inmost secrets. "The houses are transparent, Peter," he said. "If we were closer, we could look inside and see the people." "But you just said—" "You asked me if I could pick up any random thoughts, Peter." Drook's voice was calm and precise. "There are people in all the houses, but they are either asleep or dead. Sometimes it's hard to tell." People in all of the houses. People asleep or dead. The village was less than 300 feet away, and I headed toward it on the run. Drook's words had come as a shock and filled me with an ominous foreboding. But what I saw as the individual dwellings ceased to glimmer and became blocks of completely transparent crystal was so startlingly beautiful that I experienced for an instant no sense of tragedy. Then it hit me. Clad in white and flowing robes, which seemed to blend with their graceful limbs, they sat about like exquisitely beautiful statues in a museum. We went from house to house, and what we saw filled us with a pity so great we could only stare and shake our heads. The people were not dead. I took their pulses, and their hearts were beating steadily, but they had all fallen into a deep sleep, the sleep of utter exhaustion. In one house, there was a baby sitting upright in a wooden cradle. He was gripping a wooden spoon and making faces in his sleep. Shaking failed to rouse him. There was a woman so beautiful she brought a catch to my throat. There was an old man who looked like Socrates slumped above a butter churn, his long beard descending to his chest. There was a pair of young lovers holding hands. Apparently, they had gone to sleep starry-eyed together. Each house was furnished with great simplicity and beauty. There were 3-legged chairs and tables, carved of some dark resinous wood that filled the rooms with the forest fragrance, and brightly colored urns and vases, decorated with lines of strange flying birds resembling wild geese in wedge-shaped formations. There were rude spinning wheels, polished to a shining brightness, and wooden cradles on rockers, their sides decorated with carvings of scenes from daily life, which showed an amazingly bold and free quality of imagination. I was standing in a large bright room, staring at a sleeping child, when I heard footsteps. They were coming up the path outside, and they were slow and lagging, as if a man worn out with weariness was having great difficulty in placing one foot before the other. Drook stiffened and gripped my arm. "It's the father of that kid," he said, gesturing toward the cradle. "I can read his thoughts clearly. He's worn out with pain and grief, and he's been searching for his wife all afternoon. His wife went into the forest to look for her." Drook hesitated. "Something very strange, Peter. His wife went into the forest to search for a giant." "A giant?" "The giant. There's only one, apparently. There is great torment and uncertainty in his mind. He's unable to understand why the giant has not come to relieve his weariness. He is cold and frightened, and he has a stone dagger." Drook stiffened in sudden alarm. "Careful, Peter. He's at the door." The footsteps became very loud suddenly, and we both froze. The man who stood framed in the doorway was a little above medium height, with a lean, handsome face and tousled dark hair. Torment and shock looked out of his eyes, and his hands shook, and he stood staring at us in silence for a moment, first at Drook in stark disbelief, and then at me. I saw suspicion, and then unmistakable hostility flare in his eyes. That didn't surprise me. I was a stranger, and all strangers were to be feared by a people just emerging from barbarism in a world of Homeric marauders wading in from the sea, plundering and singing as they came. He might have been less frightened if I hadn't been accompanied by a gnome. Whether there were gnomes in his mythology I had no way of knowing, but a man who believes in giants could hardly fail to be chilled by a Martian. I saw him draw the knife, but I stood my ground. His movements were pitifully slow and fumbling, and I was sure I could handle him if he took it into his head to lunge at me. Something caught at the corner of my eye, and I saw that Drook was edging away from him and gesturing to me to do likewise. I must have been quite mad. He came at me with a hoarse groan, and before I could leap back, the knife was at my throat. I had never been quite so close to death. With one hand he gripped my shoulder, and with the other held the knife pressed to my jugular. You poor devil, I thought. He was going to kill me, but it would have done me no good to hate him. We were separated by gulfs of space and time and language. He had been made desperate by the ebbing of his strength and the need to protect his home from a marauder bent on pillage. I had failed to realize how quickly a desperate fear could iron out the kinks in the muscles of an exhausted man. Quite suddenly, he collapsed. The knife clattered to the floor, and he sank down and started crying like a crazy man. He dragged himself away from me across the floor to the cradle. With a great effort, he lifted himself up and looked down at his kid. He reached out a hand and rubbed the knuckles gently over the sleeping youngster's face. Then he sank down again with a rasping sob of sheer exhaustion. I watched his breathing become shallow and almost stop. The first thing a good physician does when he's faced with the problem of exhaustion is have a look at the patient's blood. With Drook assisting, I got my medicine case open and a neat little portable hematocrit set up. Now, with an ordinary 2-capillary tube hematocrit, a blood count is quite simple. The tubes are attached to a centrifuge, and when the specimen is rolled about, the number of red cells is estimated from the scale on each tube. Unfortunately, nature is a consistent wench only to a degree. Parallel evolution gives you humans more often than it gives you gnomes like Drook on the planets of 10,000 suns. But you don't always get the kind of blood you can whirl in a centrifuge and measure on a capillary tube scale, or the kind you can analyze further by staining and a specific gravity test. This time, we were in luck. What we got was the kind of blood that ran red in my own veins, only it wasn't red. It was faded, down to a few thousand red cells a cubic millimeter. Brother, that's low. It was the most frightening reduction in erythrocytes I'd ever seen, and indicated a nutritional deficiency state so grave that the sleeping men and women had no right to be alive. I looked at Drook. The man by the table was still breathing, but his eyes were shut, and he had long since ceased to mutter to himself. We were working by a table which was in the same style of art as the chairs and tables. There was a design cut in the wood which had puzzled and disturbed me before I'd set up the hematocrit. Now it took on ominous implications. It showed a dozen small human figures with their arms extended in pitiful appeal. Their legs had given way, and they were reaching up beseechingly toward a gigantic pair of hands which hovered in the air directly above them. "It begins to make sense," I said. "The pieces are falling into place."
"I'm glad they're not dreaming, Peter," Drook said. "I'm glad they're sleeping the deep, dreamless sleep of exhaustion."
His eyes filmed with imagined pain.
"I doubt if I could endure the despair which would come to them in dreams. I'd have to get out fast."
"They were reduced to despair by famine," I said. Poor harvests, the dying of their livestock. It's the old tragic story. The land isn't quite fertile enough. Advanced agriculture could save them, but their husbandry is too crude to turn the trick. I tapped the hematocrit. Their diet must have been badly deficient in essential proteins and amino acids. When that occurs over a long period, the body loses its natural ability to synthesize factors necessary for blood building.
Is there no way to help them?
Druk asked. We could teach them scientific agriculture, I said, but it would take months. From childhood, they've been taught to believe that they can solve all of their problems by appealing to the giant. I only wish it was as simple as that.
The giant?
A forest giant, I said. It's an almost universal human myth. The giant is a symbol of agricultural fertility, a mythical deity who goes striding across an impoverished land, scattering golden grain in rich abundance.
Can nothing be done for them, Peter?
They'll need stiff shots of concentrated nutrients, I said. We'll have to go back to the station for the ampules. But before we cross the bridge, I'm going to have a closer look at the land itself. The village is hemmed in by a forest, but there must be open farm country within easy walking distance. These people don't live by hunting and fishing. Their art shows unmistakably that they're in the settled agricultural stage.
I don't know, Peter,
Druk said about 20 minutes later by the watch on his beanstalk wrist, a watch that had crossed light millennia without ceasing to keep perfect time.
You may be right, of course, but this forest seems to be endless.
He stopped to mop his wrinkled gray brow and stare up at a little patch of faded blue sky. We'll find tilled fields if we keep on, I said. These people had to get their food from the land.
I wonder, said Druk.
I was losing patience with him, but he was so infernally sensitive, I didn't want to come right out and upbraid him. I saw him wince as he turned in on my thoughts.
You're not an explorer, Peter, he said. I am. I say that with the utmost humility. When you've been to the stars 50 or 60 times, you get the feel of a forest like this. Just by instinct, Peter. You can put your ear to the ground without actually seeming to do so.
All right, I said. Suppose you tell me what's up ahead. Say, a mile ahead.
Something that frightens me,
Druk said quickly.
It's breathing like an animal in pain. There are no thoughts in its mind, but there's a kind of crying. You know how a frightened child whimpers and cries in the dark.
I looked at him for a long moment in silence. Well, we'll soon know, I said. I wasn't quite sure whether I believed Druk or not, but if his purpose had been to unnerve me, he'd certainly succeeded. When I saw the light of the clearing gleaming between the trees, confidence was at a low ebb, and I didn't feel much like pressing on. But press on I did. I was determined to settle it once and for all, and I stepped out between the trees with one thought uppermost in my mind. Druk was all right. A better companion had never accompanied a man to the stars, but I couldn't have him unnerving me by sending his mind leaping ahead and conjuring up imaginary dangers. I couldn't. The forest seemed to shake and sway about me. I caught my breath, and for the first time in my life that I could remember, I knew stark, unreasoning fear. The giant lay sprawled out in the clearing, with his knees drawn up, his arms flung wide. Golden leaves spilled over him, and a swarm of iridescent insects formed a cloud about his head. He was at least 14 feet tall, and his fat, fleshy pink body was clothed in a shining garment which glistened with dew. His eyes were closed, and his chest rose and fell with his breathing, and there was a great jagged gash on his forehead, which was invisible from a distance of 50 feet. I don't know how long I might have stood there staring if Druk hadn't moved quickly past me. There was no fear in him, and his courage made me realize I was behaving like a fool. The giant had been knocked cold by a falling tree. The tree lay across his chest, pinning him to the ground, and his face was twisted in pain. It wasn't the face of a grown man. It was the face of a child. The forehead bulged, and there were little dimples in the pink and white cheeks. It was the face of a child of 7 or 8, but it was grotesquely mature in some respects, puckered and chillingly wise.
"He's been knocked out cold,"
Drook said. I nodded, looking at the strange glittering object in the child giant's hand. It didn't look like a hypodermic exactly. It was shaped differently, and there were 2 needles instead of 1, and the plunger was a solid metal job. But it was a hypodermic all right. I knelt and took the child giant's pulse. His heart was beating slowly but steadily. I noticed that his skin was pale and clammy and felt cold to the touch. "He's in a stupor," I said. "The tree knocked him unconscious all right, but just how long he's been lying here is anybody's guess. I've a feeling it may have been several days."
"What does it mean, Peter?"
Drook asked, his voice hardly audible. "Something very strange," I said, "if I'm guessing right. It doesn't do violence to any natural law, but it presupposes the existence of an intelligence that isn't native to this planet."
"What kind of intelligence, Peter?"
"That can wait," I said. "Remember what I said about the forest giant. A myth hasn't warm blood in its veins, and a myth can't be knocked unconscious by a falling tree, so the forest giant goes out the window." On an impulse, I lowered my hand until my palm rested on the child giant's cold right arm. "He's not what I thought he was," I said, "but he's needed here as no myth could ever be needed. Without him, the people perish. He's as much a part of them as they are of him." Drook said,
"What are you going to do, Peter?"
"Revive him," I said.
"Revive him, Peter? How?"
"A quick-acting stimulant to the heart, brain, muscles, and spinal cord should wake him up," I said. "I'll try a shot of caffeine. It's safer than a few other drugs I could use." With Drook hovering at my elbow, I knelt, opened the little black case again, and took out what I needed. I gave the giant a shot in the right arm. We didn't stay very close to him. Drook retreated further than I did, taking refuge behind a big rotting tree trunk at the edge of the clearing. He looked more than ever like a gnome, crouching there in shadows, his big ears alert to every sound. Watching a sleeping giant wake up can be a nerve-shattering experience. When you're responsible, it can give you an ill-defined sense of guilt, which isn't an easy thing to rationalize. He woke up slowly. First his eyelids twitched, and then one of his limbs jerked spasmodically. His breathing became louder. His chest rose and fell, and he made a gulping sound. Then, abruptly, he sat up. He sat up and stared around him, and his face was the face of a child awakening in a dark room, and blinking in a sudden burst of light from an opening door. He looked frightened, then puzzled, then reassured. He staggered to his feet and raised his hand and stared down at the strange-looking hypodermic. Then his mouth began to work, and I thought for a moment he was going to cry. I thought he was going to break down and blubber. Instead, his infant laughter rang out suddenly in the still forest, clear and joyous and carefree. Not infant laughter exactly, childish laughter. Before its echoes could die away, he'd turned and was crashing through the underbrush like a 7-year-old interrupted in his play who must hurry to make up for all the fun he's missed. But it wasn't fun he'd missed, and when we caught up with him in the village 15 minutes later, he was no longer laughing. He was kneeling before one of the houses and lifting the exhausted men and women out through an open window into the sunlight. He was setting them down and injecting them one by one. There was a tender concern in his face, and more wisdom than I had ever thought to see in the eyes of a child. We stood in shadows, Drook and I, and watched him. "I don't know exactly what's in that syringe, but I can make a pretty good guess," I said. "Tracer minerals and just the right nucleic acid hydrolysis and aerobic fermentation products. He'll overcome their nutritional deficiency so fast, you'll be able to see the color creep back into their cheeks." That was a slight overstatement, of course. Actually, it would take 3 or 4 days. But in a few days, and when I shut my eyes I could see it, the village would come back to life. There would be laughter in the houses again. Strange moons would rise and set, and infants with chubby cheeks would sit up in their cradles, and women with golden hair would smile warmly down at them. They would never have to worry about wresting a living from the land. Even the men would not have to work in the fields, but would be free to create objects of beauty all day long. No wonder the village craftsmanship was so superb. They will never know, I said. There will never be any need for them to know.
You say he came from another part of space,
Drook whispered.
A child of some tremendous super race. What makes you so sure, Peter?
It is all of a piece, I said. At most, our teleports span 100,000 light-years. We have just barely reached the far edge of the galaxy. There are giant suns beyond for 1,000,000 times that distance, from the Whirlpool nebula to the farthest intergalactic gap within range of our telescopes.
But he is a human child.
Where in space has man not encountered his own face mirrored large, I said.
Then we are no longer needed here, Peter.
You'll be glad to get back to your painting, I said consolingly. And now that you're certified as healed, you won't have to stay at the station. You can go out again tomorrow, if you wish.
With you, Peter?
I'm not an explorer, I said. Drook straightened, his eyes shining, the gnome face half in brightness.
And you'll be glad to see Seaton again, and talk this over with him, and tell him what you've accomplished.
How did you guess it? I said.
Peter, if we moved out from these bushes and let him see us.
Are you out of your mind? I snapped. What would we gain by that? Would you have him mistake me for a villager?
Just to see the expression on his face, Peter.
No, I said very firmly. It's time we started moving. I'll grant you that. But
a child has to learn and grow,
Drook said musingly.
And good parents believe in independence too. Send a child away to school. Give him a whole planet for a playground and workshop.
That's about it, I said. He nodded.
All right, Peter, let's go.
We didn't attempt to cross through the village to the field beyond. We circled the village through a woody patch and approached the teleport at a leisurely walk, as if we had all the time in the world. Drook asked me one more question before we scraped away the vines.
They wouldn't have to be mechanical in a strict sense.
Not at all, I said. We went back to Earth across tens of thousands of light-years, firm friends one moment, the next a swirl of antigravitics in the gulfs between the stars. Drook emerged thinking of bright pigments on canvas, and the loneliness of the ward, and how good it would be to go out to the stars again. At least, that was my guess. I emerged, thinking of my darling. I told myself I'd go right up to Ward H and punch my off-duty card, and we'd dine in that smoky little restaurant, even if it meant I'd fall asleep at the table and dream about giants. Jack the Giant Killer, or maybe the Cyclops who terrorized Ulysses and his crew on a high cliff above the wine-dark sea. There were some pretty formidable giants in our mythology, too. But I'd guessed wrong about Drook. He wasn't wondering if he really had what it took to go Gauguin one better. He was still thinking about the beautiful village we'd left dreaming in the light of an alien sun.
A child sent away to school,
he murmured, close at my heels.
Given a whole planet for a playground and workshop. The modern tendency is to make them as lifelike as possible. A child learns more quickly that way. His sympathies are more directly appealed to.
Giants there were in those days. A quotation. Biblical. Giants in the earth. In a minute, I told myself we'd be at the door of Ward C. I'd stop walking abruptly, and Drook would take his departure with a steady hand-clasp and a shake of the gnome head. He'd drift off into the ward.
Peter, those villagers knew about the giant, but they wouldn't have to know. They could just run down. Then the giant would restore them, and they'd go right on where they left off. If the giant were really clever, he'd never let them know. He'd never show himself at all. He might have to at first, but later on he'd keep out of sight.
I turned and faced him. All right, say it, I demanded. Get it off your chest.
He'd never let them know, Peter, that they were merely ingenious educational toys.